Awesome. So I'd love to welcome the Queer Data Lab, who will introduce themselves individually in a moment, for their talk Preferences Among Queer Individuals when Asking Gender, Sex, and Sexuality Survey Questions. The NYU Queering and Elevating Empirical Research, or Queer Data Lab, aims to improve data collection and statistical analysis as it pertains to the improving of the lives of the LGBTQIA+ community. PI Dr. Daphne Harrell, she, her, works with research assistants from the Applied Statistics for Social Science Research Master's Program to investigate issues pertaining to queerness and statistics. So welcome me and join me in welcoming them. Excuse me, my first time. Take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm just gonna assume that you can see the slides just fine. My name is Daphne. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the PI of the lab. Today, we're going to be talking about basically how to phrase survey questions. So you might have written a survey before and thought about this, and say you want to measure someone's gender identity. What questions might you ask, and what response options might you give them? And you would think about, like, what are some of the considerations you might have? So, perhaps you've done this before. If not, take 2 seconds and think, like, how would I phrase this question? Because here's the problem. There are lots of options of how to do this. Some people will split gender identity, sex assigned at birth, transgender status, ask pronouns, have a prefer to self-describe option, have even kind of more expansive response options, allow people to identify as diverse or not declared or neutral. So this is a fairly hard question, I think, that people contend with. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we can get into question writing, I just want to make sure we're on the same page about some of the terms we're going to use in today's talk. So sex assigned at birth refers to a person's biological reproductive characteristics, which might be internal, like your chromosomes, or external, like your genitalia, reproductive organs, and so on. Intersex are people who are born with sex characteristics, including genitals, gonads, hormone function, and chromosomes, that do not fit within the typical notions of male or female. Gender identity refers to social constructs and behaviors typically associated with a given sex, but not necessarily. Transgender individuals identify with a gender identity that may differ from their sex assigned at birth, and cisgender individuals generally identify with a gender identity and sex assigned at birth that align. A person's sexual orientation can refer to their physical, emotional, and romantic attraction, and perhaps their resulting behaviors. And their gender expression is how an individual exhibits their gender, including physical appearance and behavior. And this may or may not conform to a person's gender identity. We all express ourselves in different ways.
Hi, everybody. I was asked to introduce myself. My name is Veronica. I'm an A3SR alum, currently pursuing a PhD in psychology at NYU, and I'm a research assistant in the lab. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation behind this project. So why does representation matter, and how has this been studied before? So representativeness. So research has shown that when people feel demographic questions are inclusive of their identity, they judge the research as important and are willing to engage in it. This is even if the research has nothing to do with the identity in question. So it could be something entirely unrelated, and still they feel their questions are getting asked in a way that represents them. They feel that the research they're engaging in is more important. So if you don't have an opportunity to answer in a way that is congruent with your identity, you could feel uncomfortable or dysphoric. And it's important to not further marginalized communities that have been previously marginalized by research. This includes LGBTQI individuals whose research has been really extractive in the past. So it's important to not further marginalize them in ways that research has already marginalized them. So how has this been studied before? So one of the examples that has come out of this type of research of just asking individuals of how they want to be asked about these type of questions has been the 2-question approach to sex and gender. So this just refers to, like, in the image in the screen. So we have what sex were you assigned at birth, and what is your current gender identity? So this type of two-question approach came from focus group with transgender and gender non-conforming individuals. And there seems to be a preference for two-questions approach to ask about sex assigned at birth and gender identity. This is now widely used in multiple fields. It's like a way that you ask about gender, sex, and gender. It is still unclear, however, what exact phrasing should be used or how to measure other constructs that are not sex and gender. So there's the straight opportunity representativeness and ease of analysis, right? So some LGBTQI plus advocacy groups prefer to use an open-ended questions to allow for maximal flexibility in responses. That would just be like, what is your gender? Blank option, and you just fill in whatever you want. However, collecting open-ended response options represent challenges when categorizing respondents into distinct categories that are large enough to size to conduct statistical analysis. So again, this is not new to anybody in this call, but ideally you would allow people full flexibility to give whatever identity they use to choose and have an open-ended question. But then this would lead to back-end categorization regardless, because you have to do some sort of inference about the sample that you've collected. So this back-end categorization of response has been criticized as individuals now placed into categories that they did not choose. And this is just inevitable in this type of question asking. So these led us to our two research questions. So we first wanted to ask a question about sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So do LGBTQI plus individuals express differing satisfaction across 3 different approaches of measuring sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and sexual orientation? And then we also wanted to ask a question about gender expression. So do LGBTQI plus individuals express differing satisfaction across 4 approaches to asking about gender expression?
Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us. My name is Amanda. I'm a second-year master's A3SR student, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'll be talking to you about our sample composition and our experimental design. So first off, looking at the sample details, we asked 1,500 LGBTQIA plus individuals living in the United States who are 18 and up. We sourced our sample from a market research sample provider. That's an opt-in, non-probabilistic sample maintained by the vendor. And during the fielding, we used quotas for for race and ethnicity and for generation. And the way that we did this was basically we asked these questions before admitting folks into the survey so that we could monitor during the fielding process and strategically send sample to people to make sure that we ended up with a final sample that mirrored the benchmarks that we found from Gallup for the race and ethnicity of LGBTQIA identifying people in the United States. Basically, we wanted to make sure that our sample wasn't disproportionately, at the very least, representative of majority groups within the LGBTQIA plus community. So first challenge in constructing this experiment is, how do you admit people into a survey based on criteria that you are planning to then expose them to as part of your experimental design? So how we accommodated this challenge was basically to ask broadly, do you identify as a member of the LGBTQIA plus community? And if you selected yes, then you were admitted into the survey. And if you selected no or preferred not to answer, you were not. So this kind of compensated for the challenge of not exposing respondents to specific experimental arms before they actually entered the survey. So moving on to experiment 1. So we tested 3 different models for asking questions on gender, sex, and sexuality. Our first benchmark was the census, and the second was the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine recommendations they issued in 2022. And then we finally designed our own measures based on gaps that we identified and synthesis of the existing literature. And then we asked respondents as outcome variables about their personal satisfaction and community representativeness. So what they think, whether they think the questions would adequately represent others that they know in the community in addition to themselves. So thinking about the measures that we tested, the US Census is one of the extremely commonly used benchmarks for asking a variety of different questions. And because there is a status quo in multiple disciplines, we chose that as our sort of baseline for how to ask these questions. Additionally, in 2022, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine issued a report that looked at, that was the result of a coalition of quite a lot of people across across varying disciplines that asked and measured responses to different question phrasings. So because of their recency and their comprehensiveness and the broad applicability, we used this measure as well as part of our testing arm. And then moving on, finally, we wrote our own questions. So in conducting a literature review, we identified some additional changes that we would make to the national.
Let me pause you fast. There's a clarifying question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Naomi asks, by census, what do you mean? The decennial doesn't ask any SOGI question, SOGI measures.
Sure, we use the ACS, the American Community Survey. We can follow up afterwards and send links to the questionnaire.
The ACS doesn't include those measures either. I guess I'm confused. Sorry.
I think it was the household pulse survey, Amanda.
Oh, you might be right. You might be right. This is the challenge of conducting research and then presenting on it much later. So much has happened since this. Yeah, that's correct. It is the household pulse survey. We used, I think, phase 3.7 as a reference. No problem. All right. So thinking about how we asked our own questions, in addition to discussions that we had in the lab and discussions that we had as a result of the literature that we read, we came together as a lab and wrote a few different versions of these questions that we pre-tested among people in the community and then revised based on their feedback and then made final determinations from there. Note, we also excluded measures that were open-end for the reasons that Vero discussed earlier about the challenges that result in analysis as a result. Okay. Oh, so experiment 2. We also were interested in measuring gender expression. We found relatively little literature on the subject, and we thought this is we'll go into a bit about why this is an important thing to measure in the next slide. But to review the experimental design, we asked individuals to represent or to describe their gender expression in a context-dependent way. So in a variety of contexts and in a context-independent way. And we gave them response options on one scale that is masculine to feminine and on separate scales, which is masculine and feminine independent. So the combination of those two factors led to 4 different experimental settings. And we asked the same outcome measures of personal satisfaction and community representation to the respondents after being exposed to those arms. So thinking about why we want to measure gender expression. So in addition to just being like a critical part of how people in general navigate the world, but for LGBTQIA+ individuals especially, this is a component of identity, but it's also a component of things like personal safety. So in order to contribute to the body of this work, we wanted to examine a couple of different ways of asking these questions. The context was the first thing that we decided to vary. So in one context, in one experimental arm, we asked, generally speaking, how do you express yourself or how do you express your gender? And in the second, we asked in a variety of different settings, at work, in LGBTQIA spaces, etc. We'll get into the actual question phrasing in just a bit. And then the gender scales. So popular discussions of gender would suggest that masculine and feminine exist on a spectrum that on opposite poles, and that there's like some nebulous things in the middle. But we identified some challenges with that, which is that, what's in the middle exactly of masculine and feminine? This doesn't accommodate non-binary identities. There are people who express both or neither. So in addition to a experimental setting where we gave them one scale, we also gave 2 scales where they could identify independently for masculine and feminine gender presentation. Now I'll pass it over to Nick.
Hello, everyone. I am also a researcher for the Queer Data Lab. I am also an A3SR student. My name is Nick, and I use he, him pronouns. And I'm going to walk you through a portion of experiment 1 and some of our findings here. As a reminder, experiment 1 kind of looked at 3 questions, three areas here between our constructs on, so I'll be talking about sex assigned at birth and the intersex status questions kind of across these 3 constructs. Slide, thank you. So taking a look at our first one here, we have just a very straightforward question here. What sex were you assigned at birth on your original birth certificate, with a very binary construct here, male, female. And note here, this doesn't really leave any room for intersex status. So no, don't know, don't prefer not to answer style question. Whereas when we look at the next question here, we look at NASEMS, which asks a very similar style question stem, but includes options like don't know and prefer not to answer. Our construct, again, a very similar style question stem. What was the sex assigned to you at birth, comma, for example, on your original birth certificate? One of the differentiations here is really we just move from don't know to I don't know, but still keeping male, female, but including that I don't know and prefer not to answer on our questions here. Jumping into moving beyond sex assigned at birth, we wanted to make sure that intersex status was reflected in the design of the experiment. And in the instrument design out by the census, census and pulse framework, we asked sex assigned at birth and intersex status on the same screen so that respondents were able to see them both simultaneously. So noticeably, as seen here, the census and the ACS and the pulse survey don't provide respondents the opportunity to identify as such, negating the opportunity for statisticians to measure this population and give them an opportunity to be accurately counted. NASEM, on the other hand, does provide respondents this opportunity in a separate question, as does ours. And as you'll notice in NASEM's construct as compared to ours, there's very little differentiation between the two questions. Where there are noticeable differences are in both the tone and slight deviations in scale design. Our design moves away from a medical diagnosis and softens the language around intersex status. In addition, it makes note that, quote, this is different from transgender or non-binary, which respondents were provided a separate question for in the study. And finally, we moved away from a don't know to a I'm not sure or don't understand this question in the scale framework. Next slide. Jumping into the results from here, I want to remind everyone that where applicable, we showed the intersex question and the sex assigned at birth question on the same screen, albeit for the pulse/census, who did not ask this question. And these results here reflect that. Breaking down these charts, on the y-axis, we have the magnitude of the treatment effect expressed in standard deviations as we scaled our outcome measure. The treatment effect is measured by the difference in personal satisfaction or community representation between the experimental groups, which are displayed on the x-axis. So NASEM versus census, ours versus theirs, ours versus NASEM. The bars on the graph represent the 95% confidence intervals, and note that any bar crossing the 0 value, which is indicated by the horizontal dotted line, signifies that there was no significant difference between the treatment groups. Regarding personal satisfaction, we found no statistical difference between NASEM and the NASEM and the census construct versus ours versus NASEM. What the experiment did reveal, however, was that there was a significant difference between our construct and the census version, which is unsurprising that given that theirs did not ask an intersex question. You will find, however, as we do move into how respondents feel that constructs represent the communities, we see an increase in effect when compared to the census. Again, given that they didn't ask an intersex question, it is unsurprising that both NASEM and ours revealed a significant difference between them. Zooming out and considering what we've learned, one, we know intersex people represent a small percentage of the population, and our respondents who may not overwhelmingly identify as intersex and been affected by the way it was asked, but our results do show that the importance of the question being asked for community representation. Two, if you want to know intersex status, you should ask it. To that end, we should be mindful of why you're asking it and reflect on how this data will be used in your analysis. And then finally, we did not expect to notice really any difference between NASEM and our construct designs, given their similarities.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine, and I'm currently in the NYU A3SR program as well, and a researcher in the Queer Data Lab. I'll talk more about the gender identity construct in experiment 1. So for the US Census, you can see that it's also quite straightforward. They ask whether the respondents would describe themselves as male, female, or transgender, while the NASEM questions ask what is their current gender, with slightly more options and an open-ended response option if they use a different term. For our questions, you can see that there are two critical differences. We made a deliberate choice to separate the trans question and gender identity question rather than collapse them into one. While they are intertwined, identifying as transgender is ultimately a different measurement than gender. For example, one can identify as both transgender and as a woman. These two aspects are not mutually exclusive. So, and then also importantly, we use woman and man as response options, which aligns more with language that people use to describe themselves. It's more common to hear someone describe themselves as a woman and not a female, because male and female are sex options, not really gender. It is important to differentiate these terms so that respondents understand that we are measuring two different constructs. We also kept the open-ended response options from NASEM, and we also thought that it was really important in the trans question that we need to include I am currently questioning whether I'm transgender in order to allow people to fully describe themselves. For our results, for personal satisfaction, we have evidence that respondents felt more satisfied with our questions and with the NASEM questions as compared to the census. The important thing was that they were more satisfied with ours as compared to NASEM, and that difference is significant. And you can see that from the third bar, where our questions as compared to NASEM does not cross the dotted line at 0. This is a finding that's unique to gender identity. And we believe that this really came from the fact that we separated out our trans status question and gender, and also use language that aligns better with how people describe themselves. For community representation, we had NASEM and our questions doing much better than the census questions, but no statistically significant difference for ours compared to NASEM. And now for lessons learned from asking gender identity, these questions had the largest treatment effect for personal satisfaction, and we really do believe that it's because we split up the trans status and gender identity questions, and also because we used more inclusive response options. And forcing people to select transgender as a gender option excludes the possibility of identifying as both a woman or a man and as transgender, which limits their ability to express their gender identity. And I'll pass it back to
It's me. So looking again at sexual orientation in particular, the way that the census and the household pulse survey asks about sexual orientation is they give 5 response options with anything outside of gay or lesbian, straight that is not gay or lesbian, and bisexual, being something else, please specify, or I don't know. The National Academy of, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine expands on this by adding a two-spirit option that they give to respondents who identify as Native American, and they also changed the something else, please specify, to I use a different term, which generally speaking we believe to be more inclusive and less othering. And then moving on to the questions that we designed, we gave quite a few more options. We separated out gay and lesbian. We didn't posit straight in opposition to gay or lesbian. We added the terms queer, pansexual, and asexual to more broadly represent the discourse that's currently happening in the community as it evolves. And then finally, we added an additional option for I'm currently questioning my sexual orientation. We also kept NASEM's I use a different term, and of course, prefer not to answer. Now, looking at the results for personal satisfaction, we saw that both our measures and the NASEM recommendations outperformed the census. However, we observed no statistically significant differences between ours and the NASEM recommendations. And for community representation, we observed a very similar result. So looking at lessons learned, the census options leave a lot to be described. Leave a lot to be desired in terms of how they allow people to identify. Again, as folks are noting in the comments, the definition of straight is not great, among other challenges that the options provide. So it's not surprising to us that both ours and NASEM outperformed the census on personal satisfaction and community representation. However, we did actually expect maybe that we would see a difference between ours and NASEM, given that we give a greater number of response options. One of the reasons that we posit that might be the difference for the reason for the lack of difference between ours and NASEM is that we would expect the biggest differences among the groups that we added. So pansexual, asexual, queer. However, that's a relatively smaller proportion of the LGBTQIA population as currently is identified. And so it might not be reflected in the mean. Unfortunately, we're underpowered for subgroup analysis to further explore this, but it's something that we considered when we were looking at the results. Also, it's important to note here that these differences might be subtle and ever evolving, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. And getting this like exactly right is, it's the reason that we took on this project to begin with, but it's also critically important when studying marginalized populations and when trying to do the best research and get the best response rates that you can.
Hello again. I'll be walking you through some of our findings around experiment 2 regarding gender expression. As a reminder, we constructed four different variations of how to try to measure gender expression. And we found it important to contribute to the research being done on how to best measure gender expression. As we know, gender expression is key to how people navigate and experience the world. And as Amanda previously mentioned, is a key component of personal safety, specifically for LGBTQIA+ individuals. So in this experiment, we tested 4 ways, technically two contexts or 2 designs of looking at gender expression. The first approach used a matrix style format that asked respondents to how they present themselves using a masculine and feminine framework. Note, this construct did not ask respondents to choose between masculinity and femininity, but rather answer for each dimension in an effort to provide a more nuanced level of fluidity across the spectrum of gender expression. The second design moved away from that matrix format and instead forced respondents to place themselves on a binary scale within a single dimension bounded by masculinity and femininity. One of the limitations of this design is, how do you score the 3 value? It's unclear whether this might symbolize non-binary or somewhere between that boundary of masculine and feminine. Both of the questions did remain constant, and we just changed the scale framework. Was really the focus between these 2. Our third design moved away from that flat measurement on gender expression and looked to provide respondents various dimensions in which gender expression might look different. I think one of the important things to mention in constructing this style was that it's important to mention that whether out of safety, workplace environments, etc., some queer folks might feel compelled to quote code switch. Queer people often utilize code switching tactics through gestures, whether it's gestures, body language, and other forms of nonverbal communications as a means to pass as something else, and that oftentimes is straight. In social settings where they feel uncomfortable or unsafe communicating their queer identities. And this question was designed to understand that gender expression might look different in different places, in different settings, and at different times. So this framework allows respondents, although still bounded between a masculine and feminine scale framework, to respond how they might express their gender in various settings to help provide a more nuanced and multidimensional look at the measurement. Our fourth experimental arm took a similar approach here to our third, except for a redesign in the scale again. And rather than being bounded between a masculine and feminine scale, respondents were allowed to rate how they presented themselves in a mutually exclusive format between masculine and feminine, rating themselves between completely masculine and or feminine to not at all for both binary gender expression frameworks. And looking across our 4 constructs, we didn't find any evidence of preference for one of those arms over another. However, satisfaction and perceived representation across all 4 arms was generally high. We expect that this is largely attributed to respondents being probably less used to being asked about their gender expression, and that they may not have the same intrinsic internal comparison as with other constructs.
So now we're going to move into the discussion. So some takeaways, limitations, and next steps. So first, we want to start talking about recommendations for practice. So the first question we urge people to ask is, what do you want to know? And to ask questions that pertain to those constructs. So the constructs you need to measure are context dependent. Just because someone else asked a question in a different study doesn't mean you need to. So do you really need to know if someone is transgender? It's really important to not ask questions that you don't really need to for whatever project you're working on, given that these are identities that are marginalized, and you could put someone at risk by asking them to disclose any of these identities. So it's important to really consider whether you have to ask these questions. You also encourage people to ask separate questions of sex assigned at birth, intersex status, transgender status, gender identity, and sexual orientation. We see this as distinct constructs, and they should be treated as such and treated into separate questions as opposed to being lumped together. We also encourage people to use enough response categories for gender identity and sexual orientation questions to capture what people identify as, and provide opportunities to self-describe. So there's always a balance between showing people their own identity so they feel included and letting them fill out their own answers if needed. So again, we don't want, it's not practical for us to have each of these questions have 50 categories. And again, as being discussed in the chat, sometimes like you do have to cater to the cisgender straight individuals because these kinds of surveys usually go out to more people. So you have to balance those things. So again, we do think that this opportunity to self-describe offers that representation and that satisfaction without having to include every identity under the sun. So that's some implications for statistics and research. In terms of sampling, researchers usually monitor sample composition and recruitment. So more expansive response categories allow for a researcher to monitor sample composition and recruitment for online panels, particularly when you're interested in studying issues related to LGBTQI+ individuals. This seems particularly important in these cases. In terms of scoring, we test questions with explicit scoring guidelines. So while introducing a select all that apply or sliding scale for gender identity or sexual orientation might have satisfaction, it complicates quantitative data analysis. So we decided to say clear these for this step of analysis. But again, there are some push to have a select all that apply or sliding scales. So some limitations. So we meant to ask the question about personal representativeness, but have a programming error in the survey. So that way we would have these 3 separate constructs. We had some reminder that no matter how many times you look at a survey or how many people look at it, it happens sometimes. In terms of sampling, we used a convenience sample, opt-in market research panel, so it's not a probability approach. We would also wish to increase our sample size. It's another limitation that we see. So whether 1,500 is a start, it is by no means necessarily a large enough sample to encompass the identity of LGBTQI population in the United States. So some next steps. So measuring these concepts within the queer community. Not all participants liked all of our questions. So for example, 28% of participants did not consider our gender identity question to be fully representative. So this is something that we wish to continue exploring, because could this be more of a select all apply that is a difference, or is there other more low hanging fruit that we could latch onto to increase this representativeness component? And there was no evidence of a difference between across our gender expression questions. So we're wondering, is this because participants don't have an internal frame of reference? It's not something that gets often asked, so they could maybe just don't have something to compare it to. So we're wondering, like, they're not used to being asked these questions in general. So then our questions were decent, or is it just because like they don't have a comparison frame of reference? And if we assume that they're decent, then how can we improve our wording even better to maybe see these differences and to maybe increase their representative satisfaction? Oh, this is an old, the animations are remaining from an old edit. So definitely you can just go ahead and put it all up. Sorry about that. Thank you. So some next steps, you always have mischievous responders. So we have them in our own sample. that is likely to increase it when you have a cisgender heterosexual sample. So to our question, like to elicit incorrect or mischievous responses. So again, this sort of straight being defined in the way that it is, which a lot of people in the school disagree with, is sometimes necessary to define in some way, just because you're working with different populations. But it is important to consider how these more representative measures might increase mischievous responders, particularly in people outside the LGBTQI plus community. And what are the implications for this in measurement error as well? This also goes line in line with transphobic or homophobic responses. So will they drop out of the survey, or will they just like, again, become mischievous responders? And then what are the implications on response rates? Like, are you going to get a drop off in response rates from a cisgender heterosexual sample, or are they still maybe be annoyed but still complete the survey in a non-mischievous way? So these are the next questions that we have. Yeah, thank you all for listening and coming today. And now we'll open it up for questions.
So if you have a question, feel free to unmute and ask away.
I'll get the ball rolling. So wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for this fantastic work. It's really exciting. One question I was thinking about is I can imagine that asking questions in ways that people like more could increase response rates. But I imagine that's hard to see in your current sample because people are being paid to respond, right? So have you thought about that? And, you know, is that something you'd like to explore in the future? And how would you do that?
Great question. Yes, we have definitely thought about that. And I think that that type of exploration would really come in as we expand the idea of how to measure on more general population surveys. So one thing is like this study is particularly looking at how to ask within the queer community. And as we sort of hinted at, you know, we're not sure about the implications if you go beyond that. So it's interesting to think about the response rates both within and outside the community. If you're staying within the community, then yes, we would need to ask on a survey in which people are not being paid when they complete. But also, yeah, because in general, like we have, so in our survey, we had a few like attentiveness catches, like, can you write a word that starts with the letter E? And if you didn't answer that correctly, you were removed from the survey at that point. But beyond the attentiveness checks, like the people who started the survey basically completed the survey. So we were unable to explore that kind of in the current study.
We have a question in the chat from Naomi. It says, did you consider a select all option for the current gender questions, where someone could check trans and female rather than the one or the other, which is what the Census Bureau has proposed for the 2024 SOGI American Community Center test?
Great question. We did not use select all that apply questions, and instead chose to test it by splitting questions for those two separate constructs. You know, there are so many other options that we wish that we could test. That would take larger scale funding than was available at the time of project completion. I think the reason why we didn't do the select all that apply option comes to the question of statistical scoring. It's just easier for people to work in data analysis when they have a column per thing that's being asked. And select all that apply will create a lot of kind of fine-grained categories based on all the different types of combinations of what people can ask for, which then begs the question of what happens when you end up with two people in a category. Most people will back-end categorize and start to merge similar categories together. But that again places people into categories they did not personally choose. And that approach has been criticized in the literature. Like, you know, there's a book, Queer Data by Kevin Goyan, and he goes into that fairly extensively about the back-end categorization issues.
Pat, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Sure. I thought this was a fabulous presentation, and I really like the way you involved a lot of people and went systematically through the data. I actually participated all last week in a workshop on heterogeneity that was held in Berlin by some researchers at Charité, which is like the Mass General of Germany, and they were very interested in doing health surveys. So people were motivated to talk about health, and they were trying different kinds of wordings for diversity. Nothing as systematic as what you were doing, but they found that the people who were politically conservative and cis got annoyed, and so they were worried about, if they're trying to do, say, a prevalence study or try to help determine what kind of care people should get. It's tricky to try to balance these things. And so since you're a statistics group, I wanted to just pose a question about, say, prevalence. If you were trying to just get some ballpark figure of what's going on, say, with a college age population where there may be more nuance in these kinds of issues. It seems to me that one way to estimate prevalence would be to have some kind of randomization to different styles, and then have a statistical method to try to combine the data, which would allow you to offend some people in some arms and other people in other arms, but possibly come up with a group statistic. So I'm just wondering if you're thinking about this, in other words, to use what you found to advise people in education or health, where there's going to be a lot of cis folks and possibly conservatives who are motivated to be pretty negative about this.
Yeah, great question. I think that speaks towards the importance of thinking about the target population of any research study. So for us, because we sampled only queer individuals, our generalizability is towards a queer population. And because it was a non-probabilistic sample, it's even harder to generalize even to just that population. When it comes to kind of out of community questioning, I think that further studies are definitely needed on response rates and just like this kind of idea of offending people. Prevalence estimates are extremely difficult to get within measuring attributes of marginalized communities for the reasons that you brought up. But yeah, I've had a few conversations since we posted the link to this seminar with people in health settings and about the importance of like sort of different lines of questioning when it comes, for example, to medical care. There are things that maybe a social science researcher does not need to know about their participant, while a doctor would. So yeah, I don't have a great answer to your question. I don't know if anyone in the lab might have a better answer than me. Not to put them on the spot.
Well, I think this notion of using statistical methods like randomly assigning people to different questions formats so that you can have some information that could be used in a kind of a missing data analysis may be worth pursuing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that we sort of have been asked questions as well as differences in counts of each identity across the different arms. And we've been skeptical of looking at that because given how the questions were asked differently to each other, to like each of the groups, I think that that's one of the things that we were worried about having in a full study, just different responses for the same construct. Because in the end, whether someone gets incorrectly sorted or classified as like a more conservative, more liberal to see what questions they see, I think it's hard to then group them together into a cohesive category without increasing that measurement error to a point that would make us uncomfortable.
We also did ask a political affiliation question at the end of our survey in our demographics. But it's also hard because we're dealing with within community, and that community tends to skew highly liberal. So I would love to look at the subset of people also who identified as conservative or Republican leaning, but we probably don't have a ton of respondents in that subset.
Awesome. I actually have a question. So you mentioned a little bit before about mischievous responses, or potentially like when you're asking identity questions, respondents might get upset with, non-representativeness. So I wonder if there's any research on, or if you have any ideas on how to look at how the style of identity-focused question that you ask might impact sort of like measurement error on non-identity focused questions. And additionally, if there are any sort of like sequencing or maybe computer adaptive strategies that you might be able to use to mitigate increases in measurement error.
Ooh, throwing the
I
hard.
can, and like looking back at when I read the literature over a year ago, and just like pulling that from memory, I think that I remember was some testing into asking these type of identity questions at the end, which I think is just like it's common in a lot of fields. It's just sort of like the more sensitive questions towards the end. And I remember a couple of studies looking at particularly for identity questions when you're worried about the particular sample that you are researching, having that type of response to the type of negative response to identity questions. But again, that's also like part of other fields. So I don't think any specifically to this field.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely kind of a general survey principle, is the most sensitive questions end up at the end of the survey when the respondent has had the ability to build a bit of a rapport with the survey, as well as like the sunken cost fallacy, like you've already done 3 pages of survey, so like what's another 2 questions? But yeah, we didn't specifically look at any item ordering effects.
Awesome, thank you. Patrick, do you want to ask next?
Hey everybody, thanks for the presentation. This is really innovative and important work. Thank you. I was wondering if you had any breakdown of the kinds of people who didn't like these questions in your survey. You said 28% of your folks, I forget what the phrase you used, but had a negative reaction of one way or the other. What do those people look like demographically?
That's a great question. I don't think that we looked specifically at that 28%. One thing we did do was look at it kind of in the opposite. We were curious if people who identified as trans were more satisfied with our line of questioning that specifically split trans off. And we did not find any significant differences, but it's also an underpowered part of the study.
Sure.
So any sort of subgroup analysis there won't have a ton of respondents in it based on kind of the prevalence of being trans, as well as only like 500 people were even in that arm to begin with. But that's a great idea to really dig into that 28% and see if we can categorize them further.
And I forget, do you have educational attainment for your subjects? So my guess that might be a big gradient of various things, very predictor. Thanks again. This is great.
Thanks a lot. Heather?
I didn't have my mic on, sorry. Really interesting work, and something I've been especially curious about. I'm at the med school, and I put some other questions in the chat, but what I wanted to talk to you about that you brought up was around collapsing categories or cell size issues. So if I always want to ask these questions, and then we have too small of a group. And so then do I not analyze their data at all? Do I put them with something that seems aligned around any of these constructs or concepts? It's a frustrating experience. Like if I'm working with a cohort of 1,000 people, because they have a specific health condition, I'm not sampling for any of this. And so it's super frustrating, honestly, to collect the data, knowing I probably can't use it, even though the right thing to do is to collect the data. So this is more of a meta question, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question, because the question is, what is the right thing to do? Because not offering certain response categories also places people where they don't belong. So there are some lines of questioning that have been used that basically split it up and say, like, how do you identify? And if we had to categorize you, how would you like to be categorized? So that has been done. We didn't test that explicitly. This is also a place where I think that statistics needs to improve a bit further, because I think like probably the situation you're thinking of is you want to throw, for example, gender identity in as a predictor in a regression model, and now all of a sudden you have 490 people, 490 people, and 20 people, and you're trying to make inference on a group of 20. I'm guessing that's kind of where you were going with that.
Yeah, or 2.
Or 2 people.
I mean, cell size less than 10 is our enemy, right? In health research. Thank you.
Yeah.
Marley?
Hi, everyone. Great job. Really enjoyed the presentation. I have 2 quick questions, but my first one is for your masculine feminine scale, did you ever flip the ends so like it was sometimes masculine first, then feminine first? And if so, did you see any significant difference with those?
We randomized actually the order that people saw. So if it was masculine and feminine, half of them would see feminine masculine and half would see masculine feminine. If it was masculine feminine this way, we randomized in that direction. We did not analyze differences across those randomizations. So whether masculine was on the left or feminine was on the left, we didn't look at. But yeah, there was a lot of randomization to the response options that we kind of glossed over to try to eliminate kind of effects of the ordering of subcategories within a question.
Great, thanks. And just my other quick question is, why did you all decide to put the personal I in your questions versus like NASM? Just wanted to hear more about like the theory behind why you chose to word your questions in that way.
Great question.
I think there was, again, pulling from memory of over a year ago. So anybody jump in and correct me if I'm misremembering. I remember sort of like because their identity, like this question around like because their identity questions, you sort of want to put the person who's answering first. So particularly for something like it's sometimes very medicalized, that like don't know puts that burden of who defines you outside of yourself. To sort of bringing that to the person responding to the question. So that was sort of what we were trying to do. Again, I might be misremembering, but that's my memory of this conversation.
Are you asking about the sex assigned at birth question, Marley?
That one, and I think it was the transgender question. I can't remember, but yeah, no, actually it was this one.
Oh, yeah, you're right. So sex assigned at birth and intersex status, we include I'm, and I think I agree. I think it's for the reasons that that are listed. It's also just a complete sentence.
Cool. Thank you both. And thank you, Daphna.
All right, Pat had a question in the chat, and this might be our last one, depending on how long it takes to answer. Did the 28% number of persons who were unsatisfied include all 3 arms of the study 1 survey, or just the 2 arms with better elaborated questions?
So the 28 number is just our questions. So that because the point you're trying to make is that our questions still, there's 28% who still don't feel satisfied with these questions that we consider to be more inclusive. So that number increases for others.
And I believe that number is the people who didn't say they were completely satisfied. So if they said they were somewhat satisfied, they're still in that 28%. But we're perfectionists, so we're looking for complete satisfaction among every possible respondent, which of course is an unattainable goal.
You're doing a very good job towards it, though.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I think we can wrap up now. So join me in thanking them for presenting. This was excellent. I really thought it was absolutely magnificent. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, everyone.